moments in life when you feel like you're losing control, as if something inside you is growing, writhing, waiting for the right moment to emerge. For Marcus Blackwood, that moment came on an ordinary Tuesday, under the fluorescent lights of a supermarket in Portland, Oregon. The transformation he so feared wouldn't wait until he got home, wouldn't wait for the privacy of his basement, wouldn't wait for anything. The full moon had decided that this night would be different. Marcus walked through the aisles of Megamart with his hands trembling slightly, holding a crumpled shopping list. At 42 years old, he had learned to recognize the signs, the itching under his skin, the constant buzzing in his ears, the sensation that his bones were slowly lengthening. But this time was different. The intensity was much greater, much more urgent. He checked his watch. It was still 7:15 in the evening, but he could feel the moon out there, even though he couldn't see it through the store's ceiling. The supermarket was moderately busy for a Tuesday. Families were doing their weekly shopping. College students were grabbing quick snacks. Elderly people walked slowly through the aisles with their baskets. Marcus watched every face, every movement, every person who passed by him, knowing that soon all of them would be in mortal danger. His breathing was getting heavier, more irregular. The fluorescent light seemed brighter, almost blinding, and he could hear conversations meters away with disturbing clarity. He had developed a routine over the past 5 years since the curse first manifested. During full moon nights, Marcus would lock himself in his basement, chained to steel beams he had installed himself. Veterinary sedatives helped diminish the intensity of the transformation, but never stopped it completely. His life had become a series of meticulous preparations for 3 nights per month when he stopped being human and became something he couldn't control or fully understand. But that night had arrived a day earlier than expected. Marcus was certain he had calculated correctly. The full moon was supposed to be on Wednesday. He had checked multiple times, planned his activities, canceled appointments. Now, standing in the cleaning products aisle, he realized he had made a fatal mistake. The moon was already exerting its influence, and he was far from his voluntary prison, surrounded by dozens of innocent people who had no idea of the danger approaching. The first wave of pain hit his back like a hot blade. Marcus leaned against a shelf, pretending to examine detergents while struggling to maintain his composure. A woman with a full cart passed by him, her 2 small children running beside her. She smiled politely at Marcus, who forced a smile back, knowing that in a few minutes that smile might be the last thing she would see. The guilt consumed him almost as much as the physical pain that was beginning to spread throughout his body. He tried to calculate how much time he had. During transformations at home, the complete process took approximately 20 minutes from the first symptoms to total transformation. But this time seemed accelerated, more intense. Marcus estimated he had maybe 10 minutes before completely losing control. 10 minutes to evacuate the supermarket, or 10 minutes to find a way to contain himself. Neither option seemed viable as another wave of pain shot through his chest, making him bend slightly. Panic began to take hold of Marcus as he walked quickly toward the back of the supermarket, desperately searching for an emergency exit or some isolated place where he could lock himself in. His senses were sharpening in disturbing ways. He could hear the heartbeat of the child in the cart meters away, could smell the fear that was beginning to emanate from his own skin. The transformation was happening faster than ever, as if the full moon was exerting a gravitational force directly on the creature that dwelled within him. He passed by the meat section, where the aroma of fresh blood hit him like a punch to the stomach. Marcus had to lean against the refrigerated counter, fighting against the primitive impulse that was beginning to awaken in his mind. The butcher, a stocky middle-aged man, asked if he was okay. Marcus nodded, not trusting his own voice, knowing that if he spoke, a growl might come out instead of words. His nails were beginning to grow, subtly scratching the metal of the counter as he moved away. The search for an exit led him to the storage corridors, where he found a door marked "Employees Only." Marcus tried the handle. It was locked. He looked around, checking if anyone was watching, and applied more force. The handle gave way with a muffled metallic noise, and he entered quickly. The place was a warehouse full of stacked boxes, lit by some hanging lamps. It wasn't ideal, but offered some isolation from the general public. But even there, Marcus could hear everything happening in the supermarket. The customers' conversations, the noise of the carts, the beep of barcodes at the registers. His ears picked up every sound with terrifying clarity, and worse still, he was beginning to identify each person by their unique scent. The woman with floral perfume in aisle 3, the man who had eaten garlic for lunch near the beverage section, the child who smelled like milk in his mother's arms near the entrance. Every human aroma was becoming more appetizing. Marcus pressed his palms against his temples, trying to concentrate, trying to keep his humanity intact. He had read about meditation techniques, about ways to maintain mental control during situations of extreme stress. Deep breathing, visualization, anchoring in present reality. But none of these techniques had been tested against the brute force of a lycanthropic transformation in progress. The pain in his back was intensifying, as if his spine was being remodeled from the inside out. His teeth began to ache, a sharp and throbbing pain that indicated the fangs were beginning to emerge. Marcus ran to a pile of boxes and hid behind them, hoping that any employee who entered wouldn't find him immediately. He pulled out his cell phone with fingers that were already beginning to elongate and tried to dial emergency services. But what kind of emergency would he report? That a werewolf was about to transform in the storage corridor of a supermarket? That dozens of innocent people were in mortal danger because of his negligence in correctly calculating the lunar cycle? The warehouse walls seemed to be closing in around him. Marcus could feel sweat running down his face, but it was a different sweat, more oily, with a musky smell he recognized from other transformations. His shirt was beginning to feel tight around his chest, which seemed to be expanding. He tried to loosen his belt, but his hands were shaking too much to execute precise movements. Time was running out, and he still hadn't found a solution to protect the people outside. It was then that Marcus heard footsteps approaching the warehouse. Light footsteps, probably from a female employee. He crouched even more behind the boxes, praying that the person wouldn't enter, but the handle turned and the door opened with a creak. A young woman of approximately 20 years entered, wearing the supermarket's orange uniform, carrying a clipboard. She had blonde hair tied in a ponytail and a badge that identified her name as Sarah. Sarah began checking items on the shelves, noting numbers on her clipboard, completely unaware of the predator hiding just meters away from her. Marcus could hear her heart beating in a calm and regular rhythm, could smell her strawberry shampoo, could see the small movements of her head as she counted products. The human part of him screamed internally, begging for her to leave. But a darker and more primitive part was beginning to see her as something completely different. The pain in his back reached a new level of intensity, making him arch involuntarily. The movement was too abrupt, and one of the boxes behind which he was hiding slid, making a dry noise against the concrete floor. Sarah immediately stopped counting and looked in the direction of the sound. She called out, asking if anyone was there. Marcus held his breath, but knew it was useless. If she approached just a few more steps, she would discover him. Marcus tried to remain absolutely still, but his body was beginning to betray his will. His muscles contracted spontaneously, his bones cracked as they lengthened, and a low, guttural moan escaped from his throat before he could contain it. It was a sound that didn't belong to any human being, a primitive growl that echoed off the warehouse walls like a sinister warning. Sarah heard the sound and took a step back, her breathing visibly accelerating. She held the clipboard more firmly, using it almost like a shield, and called out again, this time with less confidence in her voice. Marcus could smell her fear now, a sweet and penetrating aroma that made his mouth water in a way that terrified him. The creature within him was awakening, and it had identified a vulnerable and isolated prey. The transformation was accelerating dramatically. Marcus felt his teeth elongate until they became true fangs, cutting the inside of his mouth and filling it with the metallic taste of blood. His vision was changing, colors becoming more vivid and contrasted, but also more focused on movement. He could see Sarah with disturbing clarity, every detail of her expression of growing alarm, every nervous movement of her hands. His nails had become proper claws, tearing through his shoes as his feet deformed. The orange shirt he wore began to tear at the seams, unable to accommodate the expansion of his muscular torso. Dark hair began to sprout in patches along his arms and chest, but not uniformly. His transformation maintained disturbingly human elements mixed with bestial characteristics. Sarah finally gathered enough courage to approach the source of the noise. She walked around the pile of boxes slowly, with the clipboard raised defensively, and was confronted with the most terrifying sight of her life. Marcus was crouched on the floor, partially transformed, his eyes still human but filled with a pain and rage that seemed supernatural. His face was deformed, with his nose and mouth projecting into a partial snout, while fangs emerged from his bleeding gums. She tried to scream, but the sound got stuck in her throat. Marcus looked directly at her, and for a terrible moment, she could see humanity still fighting within those transformed eyes. He was trying to say something, trying to ask for help or give a warning, but the words came out as incomprehensible growls. Sarah dropped the clipboard, which hit the floor with a metallic crash, and ran toward the door. Marcus tried to get up to follow her, not to attack, but to try to stop her from spreading panic throughout the supermarket. But his limbs no longer responded as expected. His legs were elongating, his knees bending at unnatural angles, and when he finally managed to stand, his height had increased considerably. He stumbled toward the door, but Sarah had already disappeared into the main corridor, and he could hear her shrill voice screaming to other employees. What happened next was exactly what Marcus had feared. Sarah ran through the supermarket screaming about a monster in the warehouse, her hysterical words echoing through the aisles and making all customers stop their activities. Initially, some people laughed nervously, thinking she was joking or had had a nervous breakdown. But the genuine terror in her voice was unmistakable, and soon other voices joined hers, asking what was happening. Marcus could hear everything with terrifying clarity. The supermarket manager trying to calm Sarah, asking what exactly she had seen. Other employees offering to check the warehouse, customers murmuring among themselves, some beginning to head toward the exits as a precaution. Chaos was spreading like a virus, and he was the epicenter of this infection of fear. He looked down and saw his hands, which were now a grotesque mixture of human and bestial characteristics. His fingers had elongated and thickened, ending in dark and sharp claws, but still maintained the basic flexibility and dexterity of human hands. His skin was mostly human, but patches of dark hair sprouted irregularly along his arms and chest. The orange shirt he wore hung in rags from his muscular torso, torn by the physical transformations his body had undergone. The pain had transformed into something different now. It was no longer the sharp pain of transformation, but a constant and throbbing pressure, as if his entire body was being stretched beyond its natural limits. His breathing was heavy and irregular, each exhalation coming out as a low growl he couldn't completely suppress. Thick saliva dripped from his mouth, where the fangs were now completely formed, cutting his tongue whenever he tried to swallow. Marcus approached one of the small windows in the warehouse and looked outside. There it was, the full moon, shining with an intensity that seemed directly aimed at him. It was as if it was aware of his existence, pulling him, calling him, demanding that he complete the transformation that had begun. He tried to look away, but it was impossible. The moonlight seemed to penetrate through his retina and hit directly at the primitive part of his brain. Voices were approaching the warehouse. Marcus could distinguish at least 3 people: the manager, another male employee, and someone who seemed to be a customer who had offered to help. They were discussing whether they should call the police or personally check what Sarah had seen. The manager was clearly skeptical, suggesting she might have seen a thief or someone who had fainted among the boxes. Marcus knew he had only a few minutes before they discovered the broken door and entered the warehouse. His mind still functioned partially, still managed to form coherent thoughts. But these thoughts were constantly interrupted by more primitive impulses: hunger, hunt, territory, dominance. Words that didn't belong to his conscious vocabulary, but now echoed in his mind with almost hypnotic force. He tried to formulate a plan. Maybe he could break the window and escape before anyone entered. Maybe he could hide until the transformation naturally reverted with sunrise. But each option seemed more unrealistic than the previous one. The window was too small for his transformed body, and there were still hours until dawn. Besides, the creature within him didn't want to flee. It wanted to stay, wanted to claim that territory, wanted to show all inferior beings who now dominated that space. The warehouse door opened slowly, and Marcus could hear the nervous breathing of 3 men entering cautiously. The manager held a flashlight, even with the warehouse lights on, while the other 2 flanked him with improvised weapons, a broomstick and a wrench they had found along the way. Their heartbeats were like drums in his sharpened ears, each pulse loaded with adrenaline and growing fear. Marcus crouched deeper among the boxes, but knew his presence would be discovered in a matter of seconds. His scent had changed completely. It was no longer human, but something musky and wild that would make any person instinctively recoil. Moreover, his heavy breathing was creating small vapor clouds in the warehouse's cold air, betraying his location like smoke signals. The manager, a 50-year-old man named Robert Chen, was the first to notice the displaced boxes and the orange shirt rags scattered on the floor. He illuminated the area with his flashlight, and when the beam of light hit Marcus's eyes, reflecting them like 2 golden diamonds in the darkness, all 3 men recoiled simultaneously. What they saw defied any rational explanation their minds could process. Marcus was crouched in a position no human being could maintain comfortably, his elongated limbs bent at impossible angles. His face was a disturbing fusion of human and lupine characteristics, the bone structure still recognizable, but with the nose and mouth projected into a partial snout, from which emerged fangs that gleamed wet in the flashlight's beam. His dark hair remained combed back, but now framed a slightly deformed head. The younger employee, a guy in his early 20s, dropped the broomstick and began backing toward the door. But Marcus moved with a speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics. In one instant he was crouched among the boxes, in the next he was standing, his transformed height making him seem like a tower of muscles and partial fur. His movement was accompanied by a growl that reverberated off the concrete walls like an echo from a primitive cave. Robert tried to maintain his composure, pointing the flashlight directly at Marcus while shouting for him to identify himself. But the words died in his throat when Marcus tried to respond. What came out was a grotesque attempt at human communication, sounds that began as words but dissolved into guttural growls. He was trying to tell them to flee, to evacuate the building, but his transformed larynx couldn't form the proper sounds. The frustration of not being able to communicate triggered a wave of primitive rage that Marcus desperately fought to control. He pressed his clawed hands against his temples, trying to concentrate, trying to find some vestige of his humanity that he could use to resist what was happening. But every second that passed, the moon outside exerted more influence, pulling him away from his human consciousness and toward something much older and more instinctive. The third man, who was holding the wrench, decided he had seen enough. He turned and ran toward the door, screaming for them to call the police, to call anyone, that this wasn't human. His scream of terror echoed through the supermarket, and Marcus could hear the domino effect that followed. Customer screams, the sound of carts being abandoned, footsteps running toward the exits. Robert and the younger employee were paralyzed for a few precious seconds, unable to completely process what they were seeing. During those seconds, Marcus made his last desperate attempt at human communication. He pointed to the moon visible through the small window, then to himself, trying to make gestures that would explain his condition. But his movements were too wild, too threatening to be interpreted as anything other than imminent aggression. It was then that Marcus felt the last barrier of his humanity breaking. The pain that had characterized the transformation up to that moment was replaced by a sensation of power and freedom that was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. His conscious mind retreated to a distant corner of his psyche, still present, but unable to control his body's actions. The creature had taken control, and its first prey were right there in front of it, paralyzed by fear. The growl that emerged from Marcus's throat at that moment no longer had any trace of humanity. It was a primordial sound, loaded with thousands of years of predatory instinct, echoing off the warehouse walls like a warning of imminent death. Robert finally recovered his reflexes and began to back away, but his movements were too slow, too human to escape something that had transcended the physical limitations of humanity. Marcus advanced with a fluidity that defied his partially deformed appearance. Each step was calculated, each movement economical, like a predator that had identified its prey and was savoring the moment before the attack. His clawed hand extended toward Robert, not in a quick strike, but slowly, allowing the man to see every detail of the claws approaching his face. But at the last moment, something within Marcus resisted. A fragment of his human consciousness managed to emerge from the bestial abyss and silently scream for him to stop. His claws stopped centimeters from Robert's face, trembling with the effort of containing the predatory impulse. For a few agonizing seconds, two natures fought for control of the same body, humanity desperately trying to reassume control and the beast demanding the right to hunt. Robert took advantage of this momentary hesitation and ran toward the door, followed by the younger employee. They managed to exit the warehouse and immediately locked the door from the outside, pushing a heavy shelf against it. But both knew this would offer only a few minutes of protection against something that had demonstrated enough strength to break a metal handle with bare hands. Alone again, Marcus struggled with the internal war that tore at his psyche. The full moon continued to exert its influence through the small window, pulling him toward complete bestial transformation. But every time he approached this mental precipice, memories of his human life emerged like anchors. His younger sister who still visited him on weekends, the co-workers who depended on him, the innocent people in the supermarket who trusted that public places were safe. The sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, growing in intensity with each second. Someone had called the police, maybe the fire department, possibly a medical emergency team. Marcus knew that none of them were prepared to deal with what he had become. Their weapons would be ineffective against his increased strength. Their containment techniques would be irrelevant against something that didn't follow the rules of human anatomy. He approached the window and looked at the supermarket parking lot. People were running in all directions, some pushing abandoned carts, others carrying small children. Cars started hastily, creating chaotic traffic jams as everyone tried to leave the location simultaneously. In the middle of this chaos, he saw Sarah being interviewed by a police officer, her frantic gestures indicating she was trying to describe what she had seen in the warehouse. Marcus pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window, feeling the low temperature against his feverish skin. The transformation seemed to have stabilized at an intermediate point. He was no longer completely human, but hadn't become totally bestial either. It was as if his willpower had created a stalemate with the curse, leaving him suspended between two worlds, belonging completely to neither. The sirens were very close now. Marcus could distinguish at least 3 police cars, an ambulance, and a fire truck. Through the window, he saw red and blue lights reflecting in the car windows in the parking lot. In a few minutes, the building would be surrounded by people trained to deal with emergencies, but not prepared to face something that challenged the very definition of reality. He looked at his transformed hands, at the rags of his orange shirt, at the grotesque reflection of his partially deformed face in the window glass. Marcus Blackwood had entered the supermarket as an ordinary man doing ordinary shopping. Now he was something that had no name in medical or biology books, something that existed on the threshold between human and monstrous. The full moon continued to shine through the window, patient and implacable, reminding him that the night was still just beginning. And somewhere beyond the warehouse walls, innocent people tried to understand what had happened in their quiet community, not knowing that the true nature of the danger remained unknown, waiting for the next lunar cycle to fully reveal its terrifying power.